Hey everyone, welcome back to Philosophy 160 Intro to Ethics. Today we're going to go over utilitarianism some more, that you should have gotten a general overview from the last lecture, and we talked about some objections to utilitarianism. So generally I want to start out by talking a little bit about how you should respond to these different moral theories you're going to be reading about and hearing about in lectures and talking about in your sections. So you've already been introduced to the theory of utilitarianism. Generally, it's a theory pushing for universal love and an appealing form of moral equality. So you've got this pitch on the table for utilitarianism. So how do you process that and how do you make sense of that as a student? And so the first thing you're going to want to always keep in mind is there are two things. One is your personal moral standard. So what do you think is morally right and wrong and why? And then there's your level of moral commitment. And that's how moral do you aim to be or do you expect yourself to be? And so the theories we're going to study, I've got up here, they're proposing moral standards. So they're trying to give you a standard for thinking about what's morally right or wrong or good or bad. And we'll also be talking about moral commitment as we go on, but that's not in the first place what the theories are focusing on. And so just to give you, I got a joke image up here. Look, morality is not the only thing in your life. So morality might tell you to do one thing and self-interest might tell you to do another. And those can conflict, and you're going to have to figure out where's your level of moral commitment. You know, where do you want to follow the moral line, and where do you want to maybe go with self-interest or some other aim you have in life? So that's the question of moral commitment. And what we're trying to do now is just think about the moral standard itself. What does it say? So here's one way to think about it is if you got a character like Homer, you can think he's got an angel and devil on his shoulders. He's trying to make some decision. So one question would be a predictive question, which is, what will Homer do? So that's just a matter of fact. What's he going to end up doing, right? You could be interested in that predictive question. Then there's a question of what Homer should do, all things considered. So once we know what morality tells him to do in the situation, and maybe self-interest or some other considerations, what do you think he should do, all things considered? Should he do the moral thing or not, and why? So we will get to that in the course. But right now, we want to know a question, what should Homer do according to morality? So that's the question we're focusing on right now. And so the theories we're reading about, like utilitarianism, they're proposing a moral standard. They're trying to tell you the answer to that question. What should Homer do according to morality? So I've got this joke version meme here. Basically, utilitarianism says, thou shalt promote maximum aggregate well-being. So that's the idea, is that utilitarianism is giving you a story about what the angel on Homer's shoulder would be telling him what he has to do in order to be moral. So that's where you really want to look at assessing these theories, not whether you personally think you're going to live up to them or whether you think, all things considered, you should live up to them. You ought to be focusing on, are they giving you a good grip on what morality says you should do? So that's really the focus here. And so now when you find out about a new theory, you learn about it, you read about it and start talking about it, here are the questions you want to be asking yourself. Does it track your judgments about cases? Where does it diverge from your intuitive judgments about what's morally right or wrong, and why? And then you can ask, does it capture an important part of the truth that can improve your moral reasoning? So I've mentioned before, even if you ultimately reject a theory, you can by thinking about the theory, improve your thinking about what you think is morally right or wrong. And then it might pressure you to be more consistent and think deeper. So I can talk a little bit more about this now that we have utilitarianism on the table. So think about this. A lot of you, I would expect, utilitarianism says you should dive into the pond on the low-cost pond case. I bet a lot of you think that is morally required, or at least morally good. Okay, I don't know. In this class, I can't do the polls around in person, but in the past, lots of students think you shouldn't jump into the baby Hitler case. And again, utilitarianism is going to agree with that. Now, here's the thing that a lot of people find an agreement with utilitarianism is utilitarianism says things like race and gender and class are not morally relevant. If you're deciding who to help in some situation, like there's a burning building and you can help any of 10 people, you shouldn't be paying attention to things like race and gender and class when you're making that decision. So utilitarianism definitely supports that rough idea. Okay. So now you can ask, after we get done and think about the theory, over this week, you'll be looking at objections and responses. You can make up your own mind whether you accept utilitarianism, whether you think it's right. But even if you don't, you can ask, it's pressuring you, it's giving you tools to start thinking about what moral standard of beneficence do you endorse? So that's, like I mentioned, that's clearly a part of morality according to most people's thinking. So it can help you make sense of that. The other thing is, by thinking about theories, it can pressure you to be a little bit more consistent in your thinking or to challenge yourself on that. So for example, obviously Singer tried to help you think about your judgments about low cost pond and ask, well, are your judgments you should jump into the pond and save a kid? Is that consistent with your thinking about how much personal charity you should be giving to people in need in other parts of the world? Even if you don't agree with him, it gets you to think about these different judgments in different cases and find a way to make them consistent. Another thing that I brought up last class is that if you eat meat or you eat factory farm meat, this utilitarian approach, by saying it's pressuring you to think about whether what you're doing produces universal beneficence or not, it pressures you to think about the ethics of eating meat. So again, now just to remind you, utilitarianism basically says, always and only do the most beneficent thing you can. And then Hare had these three components of it that was useful. So consequentialism, it's a forward-looking moral theory. It says morality of your actions is determined by the future impact on the world of those actions. It's welfareist because it says the only thing that matters morally is well-being impacts. And then we aggregate the well-beings and try to produce the maximum amount. So those are the three components, and we're going to start getting into objections to those. But right now, I gave you a pitch earlier last class, as we're going over now, why this is appealing. It says, no one's well-being matters more than more or less. That can seem really appealing, especially if you think of cases where people say, oh, people in this race, their well-being, I'm going to favor it. That seems like a classic non-moral or anti-moral attitude that morality tells you to get rid of. So it can seem appealing. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about objections to a theory. So here again, it's a question of does the theory track your judgments about cases, and does it explain what's right or wrong? And you're going to be given counterexamples. So these are going to be cases or classes of cases, examples where it looks like the theory might get the wrong answer, and that raises a worry about whether the theory is the one you want to accept. So our first example here you found in Freud. So one thing you might think is, think about here's a circle of life. Here's yourself, you've got family and friends, neighbors, coworkers, community, people in your nation or religion, and then strangers. So you have a circle of how tightly connected you are to people. And you might think naturally, like this thing I pulled off the internet is suggesting your degree of empathy is going to go down the further out the person is. So it's not that maybe you care about some strangers in another land, but you might naturally care more about what happens to your parents or your neighbors or coworkers. So now basically that's just a phenomenon about maybe our psychology, but Freud's reading suggests on his critique of the injunction to love your neighbor as yourself, a reason to think there's something problematic. And so the first objection to utilitarianism here is that there is morally justified forms of unequal treatment. So the idea here is I've reconstructed this as an argument. One, if you don't love people as they deserve, that's unjust. Two, some people deserve more of your love than strangers do. Three, if you love strangers just as much as the people who deserve more, then that is unjust. So if you accept the 1 and 2, and 3 just follows from that, okay? Now the key here is to notice that this is a moral claim. It's not a claim about what we predict you're going to do. It's not a claim about all things considered what we think is justified. It's a claim about morality. So it's saying that more from the point of view of morality, it would be unjust for you to distribute your love or your help and beneficence in a kind of impartial way. It's saying no, there's some kind of moral pressure on you to give preference to some people over others. And so then you can get from that number 3 I've got to it's morally wrong to love strangers just as much as people who deserve more. So because it's unjust, it's actually morally wrong for you to do that. That's what Freud argues. And then you can conclude from that the utilitarian principle of beneficence is a defective moral standard. And the idea there is it looks at least like the utilitarian beneficence approach to thinking about the moral standard says, treat everyone's well-being equally, right? So then it looks like, well, wouldn't it be telling you to promote your parents' well-being? That's a good thing, right? And promote everyone in every single race and group. Sure, that sounds really good. But now it's saying if it's treating them all equally, that's where Freud's objection is coming in and saying, no, that actually you should treat different people differently from the moral point of view. So that's Freud's objection. And so remember, there are these three components of Hare's breakdown of utilitarianism. So one thing to notice is now Freud's objection is targeting number two here. So the welfareism says the only thing that matters is well-being impacts. And so what Freud's suggesting is there actually are moral considerations other than well-being that matter morally. So there are these distinctions between different types of people in your relationship to them that determine what it's morally right or wrong to do. You can't just look at how what you do impacts various people's well-being. You have to ask who those people are, what kind of relation you bear to them. So he thinks there are these relational facts that are morally significant that aren't going to be captured by utilitarianism. Similarly, when the aggregation comes in and says you should maximally increase the sum of well-being, again, that's also something Freud is going to resist. He's going to say, no, you need to look at who deserves your help in different degrees, which is going to be explained by these relational factors, and then you have to factor that into what you're doing to help other people. So that's the way that Freud's got this argument, and he's appealing to cases to motivate you to reject the utilitarian theory. And so what you want to do now is you want to think about where do you stand on this? Okay, do you buy into this idea that Freud has, if some people, if you do not love people as they deserve, that's unjust, that's a morally bad thing, and that some people deserve more of your love than strangers do? That's what Freud thinks. So then the question becomes, which people deserve more love than strangers, and why? So you have to make up your mind about what you think about it, and then start thinking about cases that come to your mind or that are suggested by Freud. And then you want to know, why is this true or false? Okay. And so that's what you're going to do in your first think sheet, is you're going to ask yourself, why does Freud claim some people deserve more love than others? You want to go back to the Freud, look at the paragraphs that I'll mention on the think sheet, where he describes why he thinks there are some people who deserve your love more than strangers. Who are these people? What's his explanation for why they deserve more love? Then you need to ask yourself, do you think that some people really do deserve more love from you than others? And then do you think Freud's giving a good explanation of what's going on there? And the thing you want to keep in mind I've got over here is there are people out there who could say, oh yes, I think some people deserve more love than others, people in this one race, right? So you don't, whatever explanation you're going to have for why you think some people deserve different treatment, you want your explanation to be a good one. You don't want it to be one that someone who supports racism could also try to appeal to. So that's the question here, is how do we get a good objection to utilitarianism based on what Freud has said? So I'll pause here, and then we'll come back for the second half of class. Hey everybody, so hopefully you're back from the think sheet where I had you dig a little bit into Freud's text, which is one of the things I'll be encouraging you to do as we go on, is to sort of look closely at what the reasons people give for pretty specific claims. And sometimes you might agree with the claims, as I've mentioned, and you may not accept the reasons they give. So that's one of the things you want to be thinking about when you do these readings and dig into them. So we're talking about objections to moral theories. And again, these are theories of the moral standard that you're going to want to adopt. And then there'll be this question of what level of moral commitment you want. And we're looking at counterexamples. And so those first counterexamples, we're supposed to motivate you to reject the idea that morally speaking, all that matters is well-being, and you should treat everyone's well-being equally. So our second objection here is going to build off some of the information we had in that first one, but it's a different objection. So before I move into the next one, I want to mention in the Freud, as you probably remember, he did bring up these cases of friends or family members or your friend's son that he thinks you should love more than a stranger. And he made some rather striking claims about how maybe you shouldn't even care about strangers as much as you care about yourself. But he adds another thing in the rest of the reading. And one of those things is he talks about enemies. And he generally emphasizes the aggression instinct in human beings. And he has a rather harsh view of what you should expect of strangers, in the sense of predicting that they will be like. He thinks they might be quite unfriendly to you. And that's a second argument for unequal treatment, as he thinks, at least there's no reason for you to be treating people who are your enemies beneficently. So that's a second type of sub-argument here for unequal treatment that I haven't emphasized too much. I'm mainly having you focus on that first one, but I wanted to bring it up. And related to this idea of enemies and the aggressive nature of human beings, there's the second objection that's in the Freud. And that's that the utilitarian standard is psychologically unrealistic. And in some way, it's demanding too much of you. So this is going to be an idea we'll see that will recur, is that one question people have is, should your moral standard, it obviously needs to expect it to be kind of demanding of us, and we might worry we don't always live up to it, and we should feel bad when we don't. But could there be a standard that's just too demanding? It's sort of an unrealistic standard even to adopt, regardless of whether you're going to try to live up to it, just even to judge yourself by it. And there's going to be a principle we'll talk about when we get to Kant. Immanuel Kant will be big on this when we talk about it more, and people talk about the principle of ought implies can. And the rough idea here is that if you morally are required to do something, then it has to be something that it's reasonable for us to expect you to do. And that means you have to be able to do it. And so I'm going to give you a little argument I've reconstructed on Freud's behalf. It's not in the Freud, to make sense of this idea and why it could lead to an objection to utilitarianism. So here's my argument is, so first of all, the first premise I've got here is, if it's morally wrong to do something, then it's fair to blame someone for doing it. So you might just assume if you're doing something morally wrong, you could be blamed for it, right? I mean, that's just, it seems like if you fall short of a moral standard, other people have good reason to blame you, and maybe you could blame yourself and feel bad or guilty. Okay, now if you think that's right, if it's fair to blame someone for doing something, then presumably they could have done better. So the idea there is that for some reason it's built into the idea of when it's fair to blame someone, that you have to think that people could have done better than the thing you're blaming them for doing. If that's right, then if it's morally wrong to do something, then you have to think, well, when it's morally wrong, they did X, they could have done better. So that's the idea, that if it's morally wrong to do something, they could have done better. That's ought roughly implies can. So the idea there is that if morality is demanding something of you, then you can do it. And I'm motivating that and connecting it with this idea of fair blame to help you see why someone would think that. Now we got number 4, the utilitarian standard says things are wrong, but people couldn't have done better. So the utilitarian standard would be defective. So the idea there is, if the utilitarian standard is saying you should treat everyone equally. Now, one thing Freud is saying is he's giving you reasons to think, number 4, the utilitarian standard is saying things are wrong, but people couldn't have done better. And his idea there is, just given the way our psychology is set up through evolution and our culture, it's not realistic to think that people could make themselves treat everyone equally. So he thinks that there's a psychological inability there. So people couldn't do that. So if you blame people for not treating everyone equally, that seems unfair. And so then that's basically what the worry is that the utilitarian standard is encouraging. So this is a worry about the utilitarian moral standard. It's not just that people wouldn't want to follow it, it's that they can't. And so therefore that there's something defective about it. And so we'll come back to this objection and utilitarian responses next lecture, and the first objection. But we want to get on to our third objection today. And so the 3 objections we've already talked about, the idea that there might be morally justified unequal treatment, say for your family or your friends, right? Then we've got a worry about how psychologically realistic it is to try to be someone who's that impartial and treat everyone equally. And then the third main objection to utilitarianism was from that David Brooks article I had you read. And the worry here is that beneficent ends don't always justify the means, and in particular, beneficent ends don't justify unjust means. So, okay, what does this mean? I want to unpack this. You probably heard the ends don't always justify the means. Let's give you some examples. And so basically the idea here is they're going to give you counterexamples to utilitarianism, where utilitarianism says you should always do the thing that maximizes the most well-being outcome, the aggregate well-being. And so that's the end that tells you to aim at. And there are going to be cases where it looks like you could do that, but in order to do that, you're going to have to take some unjust means. You're going to perform some unjust action in order to bring about the maximum aggregate well-being. And that's going to look morally problematic. And that's going to put pressure on the utilitarian theory. So first example is from the article. This is Ursula Guin, and she's got this short story. If you're interested, she's a great writer. I recommend the short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Alumnus. And if you read the story, there's this child kept in a closet in order to have the majority of people in the society basically live in a utopia. this child's life is miserable. And you could think about those other examples. Brooks took this as an analogy for various things that might be true about our own society and our own lives. And so you have to ask yourself, if this person's suffering can lead to overall more well-being, it looks like, according to utilitarianism, that's the morally right thing to do. But a lot of people have the intuition that seems wrong. So, and then the worry there is you have to look more than well-being. You have to ask whether certain actions are just or unjust. And you can't just be focusing on trying to maximize the well-being outcome. A second famous example is, imagine there's a sheriff. So this is, I have a picture of a attempt to break into a courthouse and lynch some people in San Jose in 1933. So I'm just saying there are these cases that in the real world that you can use your mind here. Imagine that there's a mob that forms outside a courthouse and they demand some prisoner in there. And they say, we want to hang that prisoner. Now, this guy isn't a fair trial. Maybe the sheriff even is convinced the guy's innocent, but the mob is just, crazy. They're banging on the door, and then the sheriff knows if he doesn't give them the prisoner, they are going to riot and they're going to go kill tons of innocent people. Like, this is a crazy mob, right? So his choice is he can execute an innocent person to satisfy the mob and they'll go home, or he can protect the innocent person and not kill him, and then the mob is going to go nuts and go kill a bunch of other people, just in a crazy spree. What should the sheriff do? And so, as I'll talk about in a minute, it looks like the utilitarian calculus would tell this guy to sacrifice the innocent person. A lot of people think, well, okay, that's wrong. And the reason it's wrong is it would be unjust. So this is another case of, it looks like promoting the most aggregate well-being could lead you to perform unjust actions in a way that actually is not morally good. A third simple example would be, maybe you could cover up your friend's cheating to avoid her being kicked out of KU. Let's say you have some friend, they cheated. If they do, they're going to get kicked out. It's going to have horrible repercussions for their life. And you think, look, if I cover it up, it's not really going to lead to, no one's going to really get hurt. So I understand normally I shouldn't help friends cover up cheating, but like in this case, if I just think about it, I might be really convinced that it's not going to hurt anybody, or the harm is going to be so minor. If the professor never finds out and nobody else finds out, no one's going to get hurt, and it'll create a massive well-being increase for your friend. So again, utilitarianism, if it just says, look, a beneficent outcome, being beneficent is always the right thing to do by whatever means necessary, well, that part starts sounding a little sketchy, right? When there are all these actions that look unjust or immoral. So we're going to talk about the utilitarian responses, but I just wanted to go over how you can apply that schema procedure to see how this works. So take the sheriff's dilemma. The sheriff can either execute the innocent prisoner or protect the innocent prisoner, okay? Who are the interested parties here? Okay, I'm just going to say, well, if he executes the prisoner is going to be affected a lot. He's going to be harmed. If he protects the innocent prisoner, well, the mob's going to go on riot and kill a bunch of other random people, okay? So they're going to be affected. All right, well, now we just measure it up. If they execute the prisoner, there's a huge harm to the prisoner. So there's one huge harm, right? One person was killed. That's a bad thing. That's a huge well-being harm. Now, okay, but if you protect the innocent prisoner, then he's not going to get killed, but now tons of random people are going to get killed by the rioters. So that's a huge number of huge harms. So if you just think about, okay, now if we were going to aggregate this together, what does that mean? Sum it up. Well, you got one person being killed on the left side, and you got many people killed on the right side. Well, you just count up the deaths, and how much well-being is being lost here. It looks like the morally right thing, according to this procedure, is to execute the innocent prisoner. So now some people, that just might strike you as wrong. So you might think, okay, this is just a case where it looks to me like the utilitarian standard is getting the wrong answer. The other thing you want to notice then is what's gone missing. So that's when you think a theory's got the wrong answer, you could think about what is it missing. And in this case, you might think, what did consequentialism say? It said, look only to the future, all and only well-being matters. Morality requires a maximal increase of well-being. And so like our case we talked about before Freud, this case raises worries about 2 and 3 here. So the idea that only well-being impacts matter, you might want to say, no, the injustice of killing an innocent person is itself morally bad. So killing an innocent person is morally bad, and not just because of how it's going to affect his well-being. there's something this person you might want to say has a right to life, right? Or something like that. That is a consideration independent of well-being. So that's what we're going to see going forward is some moral theorists are going to say we need to add into our list of the important moral factors in our moral thinking, not just what well-being does matter, beneficence does matter, but there's going to be another category of respect for rights, respect for persons, people's rights. That's going to be another set of issues. And you might think in this case, that's why it's getting the wrong answer. And then similarly with aggregating the ultimate well-being, you might think, look, just if I know if I'm going to save 10 people, but I have to kill another person to do it, just measuring the well-being outcome doesn't give me the right answer. I need to keep track of what I'm doing here. If I'm killing an innocent person, that itself has moral significance. That's a deeply wrong thing, independent of how it impacts well-being. So that's where we're headed. You want to think about these objections, and the end of class think sheet, I'm going to have you think about, do the Chima procedure on one of the other cases and think about what do you think is right or wrong about in this case? What did the Chima procedure tell you? And what do you think is missing, if anything's missing in that Chima procedure? What factors is it not bringing into account? So that's it for today. And then we're going to be coming back next class with some utilitarian responses to these objections. And then we'll be turning our attention to theories of the good life. So hope you are staying warm, and I will talk to you soon.